Emotional algebra, where the heart meets the math. What is integral is derivative as you figure out your path. Power plus emotions equals more than you can see. Listening to the wisdom of our host, Dr. E. Emotional Algebra with Dr. E.
Welcome to Emotional Algebra with Dr. E. Emotional Algebra is a podcast that helps listeners to understand the subtle calculations people make every day in their relationships with others. It's a podcast to help us all become better people through understanding the different variables that drive our behaviors. I'm your co-host, Andrew Tavani.
And I'm Dr. E.
Dr. E, good to see you. We are here today with an episode. I know this podcast is called Emotional Algebra. I feel like today's discussion is almost going to be talking about an emotional hurricane in some respects.
Yeah.
We're going to be discussing a very popular Netflix show right now, which I have to say up front, I have not completed, but I believe it's a 4-part series. You want to tell people what it's titled?
Yeah, it's called Adolescence. It reminds me a lot of 13 Reasons Why that came out in 2017. That was about the suicide of a teenage girl in American culture. This one is based more in the UK, whereas I feel like both shows really told a story about the life of what teens are going through in ways, and it brings in a lot of it's like a mashup of all the different issues that our kids are facing, and even that we're facing in ways as parents, culture, society. I feel it touches on bullying, on social media culture, on parenting and parents and education. So it really brings in all these pieces in a way and weaves the story that I believe is to really help us to take the opportunity to understand what our kids may be experiencing, understand what we may be experiencing too, in ways that we might just not see the whole deeper meaning to, because we're caught up in our own day-to-day lives.
Yeah, and also because with the social media aspects of this, it's not always readily available or readily something that adults can easily monitor. The social media use between teens and whatnot it can be a mystery.
Yeah, and that's brought out in this episode. So yeah, let's just go ahead and dive on right in. There's a lot to discuss, and for viewers, even before our setup, we spend a lot of time discussing, and we're actually getting into some of these deep discussions between Andrew's view of things and my view of things, and these are the discussions to me that we want to be able to have an open discourse about and be able to ask questions, not assume that one person is right and the other person's wrong. I don't want people to assume that because I have all this expertise that I'm the right one in this, and telling you as parents or teens or listeners how you should be living your life. These are things I want you to really ask yourself and look deeper. That at first glance, things on the surface often seem more simple than they may be when we get into the algebra, when we get into, as Andrew mentioned, the idea of the hurricane and getting spun around and all the wind and the debris and the rain, and how can we really see our way through that very well when we're just trying to survive it. And I think in many ways, that's sometimes what our kids are also feeling, is how can we get through it when we're just trying to survive it? And how can we really see with clarity when there's so much going on around us that we're trying to have some understanding or control? And then the next piece in there, the last piece really that we want to touch on, is how are parents getting through this, when so many times parenting can feel like just a daily battle, unfortunately, versus a journey with our kids of self-discover and collective understanding. And that's what I'm hoping that, again, we can open up some dialogue for their kids and parents to find a solution for some of these issues together.
Absolutely, Dr. E. As you mentioned, there is a lot to talk about. I think we should say at the top, though, that there may be some spoilers here. So spoiler alert, if you are somewhere in the middle or haven't watched the episode, you may want to just consider that too. That we may give up a few details about the series.
It's not that we will give
we
up.
Will, right?
Because, yeah.
So
No doubt about that.
So be duly warned. if you proceed from this point on, you will have some spoilers. All
Yeah,
right, let's
yeah.
get to
And
it.
again, I hope that as viewers, if viewers haven't seen this and they watch it, that you can watch it with this different lens. You can watch it asking some questions and even stopping and discussing. I think that, and even if a parent wants to watch this to screen it first and then even get their ideas, it's a good idea sometimes to go back and watch these with your kids and just get their thoughts. Don't tell them what you think. Ask them what they feel, ask them what they think. Do you feel like this accurately represents things? Do you feel like this is hyperbole? Do you feel like this is digging too deep? And then, be able to ask why. And because I think, again, one of the things that we get into here is, just to kind of dive in, is I spent a lot of time talking about bullying and how bullying is really just endemic to so many cultures. It's something that's based in the idea of hierarchy and having power over. It's not about power with. And throughout this whole series, you see different forms of bullying and or how people feel bullied. What comes out through this episode is this child who commits this act of murder feels bullied. He feels bullied as it comes out by the girl that he murders. And what we want to look for in our cultures are the bullies and the victims. We often want to hate the bully and we want to feel sorry for the victim. And as you start to walk through this and you understand this murder and you start to see what happened behind it, in no way is my discussion trying to diminish the actions of this child and or diminish and or explain away the actions of the teen culture, the girl who's murdered. It's about explanations, not excuses. And I want to make sure that that is clear. We're looking to explain behaviors and actions. So Andrew, let's go to that slide
Yeah,
and
yeah,
touch on the slide because I want to review this real quickly because we will be coming back to this.
yeah.
So if
Real
we
quick before we do, Dr. A, just want
Mhm.
to say two things about the age thing, and we can address this at the end, but I just want to get it on the record so we don't forget to go back to it.
Mhm.
Talked about watching it with your children, and let's answer this at the end. But what is the appropriate age for kids to watch this? Because this is not a this is no walk in the park type of
No.
viewing, for one thing, and secondly. One thing I was struck by was the age of the actor who plays the 13-year-old child in this, and this was also his first acting role. So I want
Mhm.
to talk about the effects of putting a young child into such an emotionally challenging and emotionally demanding role. But we can get to that at
Right.
the end. Let's get to your slide now.
Right, right. So as we're looking and remembering back on the roles we play that disempower, remember we have the victim. And I say we live in a victim culture. We don't live in a bullying culture. We live in a victim culture. Why? Because if we remember back to this, victims often can thrive through this. Victims are often looking to be rescued. All right. So when we go back to that and we kind of click further on, you can have all these different roles where people feel victims, but it's really not about being a victim, it's about feeling victimized. Because when we take on that role of playing the victim or being the victim, we've basically surrendered our power at least to a persecutor, and if not in some cases, to a rescuer who we hope will take care of us. The biggest thing that I see throughout this mini series is how so many people feel victimized. The child felt victimized by the girl. The culture saw this girl victimized by her perpetrator of the crime, of the murder. The teachers feel victimized by their students. The students feel victimized by the education system, and they're seeking control over that. Kids feel victimized by their parents. The parents feel victimized by the peers or by the peers of their son, and even sometimes by children. So we have to see how these roles are so blurred and so overlapped that often we fall into that place of what do I do? How do I react? How to respond? So if we take our view of this roles that disempower, remember our dichotomies: good and bad, right and wrong, strong and weak, and win and lose. So victims often have to be seen as good and right, yet they feel weak. So they have to defend the things that they might feel bad and wrong about, which is why they twist the story. So let me give you an example in the show is when the child is in the perpetrator, Jamie, is shown the video that was on cameras, observational cameras in the community of the murder. He continues to say, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. He's trying to defend himself against with his dad and against reality so that his dad would still be potentially seen as his rescuer. He didn't want to feel like he could do something so bad. And I think in his head, even people often believe the story they tell themselves and the story they tell others. So he could not be seen as bad and wrong. Yet he was being kind of who became the persecutor, but the police. Whereas the police see the victim, the murdered victim, as the victim, and they're seeing this kid as the persecutor, and they're trying to understand how could a 13-year-old commit this crime. So even they're facing these issues of here's a child harming a child. How did we get here? And that's a lot of what, to me, the while they go in with force and they show this force in the beginning with all of these police going in the beginning to show the seriousness of this action. And if those who haven't seen it don't necessarily understand what they're going in for, it then is this whole understanding of who is the victim. And that's what becomes very muddy and blurry through this, and finding out how the person, how the female who was murdered, how she justified her behavior and her own victimization, how she treated Jamie, and how then other people in the community justified their victimization or their persecution of others, whether it was tagging the dad's van throughout this, and then his justification of his victimization of taking his anger out on the kids he knew who tagged his van, who were making fun of the dad as they rode by on their bikes. And what did he do? He justified his persecution of them. So we see this pattern of victimization and persecution when there are no perceived rescuers. Who are the rescuers in this culture? All the people who were supposed to play rescuer, in essence, it could be seen that they failed their job. The parents didn't rescue their kids from the circumstance that happened in this subculture of secrecy and guilt and shame and trying to have power over and playing what they've seen in the culture. The police failed in their job to understand why this could have happened. And in one of the episodes with when the son of the inspector is talking to his dad, saying to his dad, you don't understand. You don't understand what even the emojis mean. So even social media became the object of victimization, or the place of persecution and victimization. And so we look at even those who manage our social media and run our social media programs, they're failing at really seeing how they can be part of the solution and rescuing. Again, society as a whole, we don't see rescuers in so many corners. And while people can feel that this is a UK issue, it's to me, it's an issue around the world. It's just manifested in different ways. And that's the thing that I want people to see. So we also want to look at this situation of instigation. Who instigates in all this situation? Justified persecutors who feel like victims first, and they say, I'm doing this to you because you did this to me. Or even in court, we often have justified persecutors who are saying they were victimized first, therefore I shouldn't have to suffer the seriousness of the crime. And in some ways that may be a justifiable defense in ways, while we still want to look at that there are still always going to be people who wants to instigate. They want to start the conflict, and that's often where we get our power. And we'll get in touch in a little bit of that, Andrew, as we get into our discussion about the issue of masculinity. And I want to talk to that. So we talked about the choices for the victim are justified persecution. In other words, you started it, I'm going to finish it. Or learn helplessness, where we just fall into it and take it and take it and take it. And I think what we're seeing is that people are tired of taking the abuse and taking the pain and don't want to keep living in fear. So all around different aspects of our culture, we see justified persecutors and people coming out of the shadows rather than staying hidden in them. And that to me leads to an opportunity for change and understanding rather than pointing the finger at all the reasons why other people should feel like it's their fault. I think when we can stop and look back at it and see how for all of us, where does our responsibility lie?
Yeah. And so one thing I want to back up on here, Dr. E, is you talked
Mhm,
about this sort of being a universal problem, social media, the
mhm,
bullying, the way the two work together. Because what little I've seen of this struck me as very, very UK centric, but you're saying these problems extend to the US, to other cultures as well. And so one thought I had was that if bullying is so pervasive, you said endemic earlier, this show happens to explore a very extreme example of the worst case scenario. For all the bullying that goes on,
mhm.
in the UK, in the US, in a country the size of the US, 330 million people, there are relatively few outcomes this dire.
Well,
But
what
there,
was our first special episode about? Do you remember? Back in
mm,
September.
it was about a school shooting.
Right.
Yes. And-
And that's in the United States. Where do most of these school shootings happen? What we have here is you have a difference in the supply of guns in two different
right.
countries.
Okay. So that, yeah, that you're talking about weapon of choice. Just to make clear, in the show Adolescence, it's a
Yes.
stabbing. It's a knife attack.
Yes, and it so if he had had access to, and this is not a discussion on gun control.
Right. Yeah.
This
Not
is
at
a
all.
discussion on what tools do we have available to turn into weapons. And many people, like we said, you can see a knife as a tool or a weapon. You can see a gun as a tool to help me hunt for survival or for for sport or things, but it becomes a weapon. So the thing we have to look at is in countries where you don't necessarily have access to guns, do you have more stabbings? And this is a situation where now you have this use of this weapon used moving into younger and younger ages, where a kid who grew up in a bullied culture, who um, wanted to try to take the ultimate power over somebody, acting out, it only had one victim versus two or three or 10 or 20 that we would potentially see in a school shooting. So if he had access, would this to a gun, could this
Yeah.
have been a different
Yeah.
fact?
That I think the difference there is UK is far less of a gun culture than the US. I mean, Second Amendment here, gun culture is sort of enshrined in the Constitution. Not the case over there. I was more talking about um, just the sheer volume of bullying going on and the
Mhm,
total outcomes of that result in a school shooting or a stabbing like this. Um, by by far, these are outlier episodes. Um, there may be other things, right? Like if you think about the total number, if it's endemic, right? It's going
mhm,
on every day, almost all day, and
mhm,
on social media, perhaps
mhm,
nonstop. So my point is this is an extreme example. However, somewhere on the continuum there's maybe physical violence that doesn't result in a murder, right? There's just verbal abuse that doesn't quite approach the physical violence, but is still damaging in other ways, right? So there's this whole like spectrum of bullying and outcomes is what I
mhm.
was getting at. So I think for the purposes of TV and being dramatic and whatnot, they picked the most extreme example. But there are many other examples where people maybe don't even have a criminal recourse, right? They don't have a legal recourse, but
Mhm.
nonetheless are still affected in some way by bullying.
Yeah, and again, I think even there, the issue with the social media aspects of this and the bullying, and it's almost like sometimes I don't want to talk about bullying being successful or bullies being successful, But even in these situations, sometimes your most successful bullies are the ones who can slide it by and get away with it. And you're left questioning yourself. Did they really mean that? Did they really say that? And that's where we have to look at, how sarcasm plays a role in bullying, and how arrogance and, all these protective emotions play the game, and then being able to switch it and twist it and then be a victim instigator. Well, I didn't mean that. I mean, I remember playing basketball as a kid one day, and I was on a team, and this one kid he just kept baiting me, and it was a very sly way he was baiting me, and I lost it. I lost it and took a swing in the middle of the game after he made a comment about my shot, and everybody looked at me. And even if you look at this at many bullying situations, it's the kids who react. It's like in sports when the guy who gets the flag thrown on him for the for the penalty is often reacting to what the other guy was doing, the taunting and things. So we want to look at that. That happens so often, and even with teachers and parents who bully their kids, who then wonder, why are my kids reacting to me this way? So yes, bullying happens all the time and every day in almost every aspect of our culture. I really do see it that way, but we don't recognize it because it's, well, he just said this. And I think the worst thing we can do is explain it away versus see where we can take responsibility for it and our actions.
Yeah. By the way, another reason that you may not recognize it is because you can't even see it because it's happening on Instagram, Snapchat, whatever. And depending on your parenting style or depending on, what you permit in your household, and I'm not suggesting anyone should do, they should parent as they see fit, but you just may not even be aware of it because it's all happening on social media. It's all very ephemeral.
And even again, an example of of Jamie, the main character, when he was being interviewed by the psychologist in the second episode, I believe, second or third episode, but he talked about his dad going to his soccer games, and he didn't feel very successful in sports. And he said when it would make a mistake, his dad would just turn away and look away, which he felt he had totally embarrassed his dad and was just a horrific son in that way because he couldn't do what he thought he was supposed to do right or well, which is, soccer or slash football is such a cornerstone of culture in the UK that he felt he was letting his dad down. And even when he lied at the beginning, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, he didn't want to lose the favor of his dad. He was looking for love and respect from his dad. So even being bullied, kids often don't go home and tell their parents because, and again, going back to I didn't tell my parents when I was bullied because it felt humiliating enough to feel bullied that then I have to go tell my parents, hey, this is happening to me. So a lot of kids try to handle these things themselves. They want to be young adults when they're still kids. And what is the act? Again, the act of violence that happened here is a kid wanting to be an adult and commit this adult action when so many kids and even adults don't know how to handle situations that happen as adults because they're still using anger, rage, hatred, verbal actions, physical actions, actions on social media to try to handle issues that could be discussed and understood and accepted when we look at the deeper issues behind them. So that's where I think we really want to take the outcome of this whole discussion is how do we all see our role in these actions that we're seeing in our drama, in these dramas that are unfolding on TV, but are also unfolding in our daily lives and are affecting our kids, whether we realize it or not, because they have become numb to these issues, and so have we.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so much, so much to discuss here in terms of all the themes in this series. You brought up masculinity, so let's get into that. There's a lot of questioning of masculinity in this. I know in that scene you were talking about the psychologist, she was asking about how he viewed his father and even his grandfather. What are you seeing there? What are your thoughts there, Dr. E?
Well, she's trying to look for a pattern of behavior. She's trying to see, was this something that he was taught violence from generation to generation? And clearly, in the show, he didn't want to give his father or grandfather up. And for the most part, they were hardworking men, um, seemed in some way, again, supportive in their way, and weren't violent. He said his dad lost his temper here and there. And I think you see a confusion in, how am I supposed to be a man in a culture where so many things around him potentially taught him about power over. They talked about they brought up some of the vloggers, and I'm not going to mention names. I don't want to give any and Andrew and I both agree, we do not want to give any press to people who sow what can be seen as toxic masculinity. I want to avoid the use of the word toxic a lot through this, because I think it makes it bad and wrong. But I think what we want to see is there are people out there in our media and social media, and even in our circles of politics and other corners of our culture, that are sowing this idea of what masculinity should be. And I think we want to look at that idea of, where are we evolving to, and how are people who are trying to create that idea of men should be men and have power over women, how are they holding on to me, some things that are in the was? And how are we free to express ourselves as men in a way that expresses strength and expresses courage and and it also acknowledges potentially fears and doubts? To me, it takes more courage to express sadness and fear and shame and guilt than it does to hide it behind this idea of anger and rage and hatred and arrogance. So we want to see where true strength comes from. So as we see people out there who are sowing this idea of what a man is supposed to be, I think we want to look beneath the surface, and we want to look at our opportunities to grow. We want to look at our socialization and ask ourselves how we get here. We want to look at at our ideas and say, are we being pulled back to living in the was versus being in the is? And in that, we want to look at an acceptance for everybody, and seeking understanding versus seeking judgment. And understanding, even people who are vlogging about men should have power over women, and even people who express that, we got to look at the underlying potential for fears that are driving those behaviors that they might not even understand, because they have to be blind to weakness, because they want to be perceived as strong. And that, to me, is what happened with the character. Is he was blind to me, to those, or not, he understood what he was feeling, but he had to show strength, he had to show power over, even with the psychologist who he threatened, because he couldn't stand the idea of a woman having power over men, whether it was with him, or whether it was even with one of the prison guards who she waved off in the episode, and he reacted to that, because his idea that men are supposed to have power over women.
Why do you think that he felt he had to show strength? What?
Well, I think we got to look at, we're kind of getting to the unfolding of this whole issue of what was Jamie seeking throughout this whole episode. The idea of what he was seeking was, when he wanted to ask this girl out, he felt, first of all, he felt unlovable. It's very clear. He felt like he didn't fit in. He was bullied by peers. He was bullied by other girls, and that's what drove him to the act, was, again, feeling bullied by this girl who said, "I don't want to go out with you to this thing," because he felt like she had been compromised enough by the pictures out there. They thought, "Hey, maybe she'll go out with me." In the interview with the psychologist, he kept asking her, "Do you like me? Do you like me?" So what we want to go back to now, we're getting back to parenting. What are the ways that the parents demonstrated that they loved their son? Was it outrightly discussed? Did the dad know how to show his son that he loved him? And did his dad even love himself in that way? So what is his dad's upbringing? The psychologist talked about the dad and his grandfather, Did she really dive into the mom? How did your mom express love? How did your mom show you this? Did your grandmother show you love? Who are the important women in your life? He had his sister. How did his sister and him get along? So we're getting into that idea, not just about Jamie, but as men in general. How are we shown love? And are we socialized differently, again, to be strong versus good? And I think that's where we've talked about in previous episodes that women are often socialized. If you go back to, what are little girls made of? That saying, what was it? Sugar and spice and everything nice. And boys are socialized pretty much to be strong. And it's something about I don't remember the whole thing, but the thing that goes into puppy dog tails and things like that. So we want to look at how we're socialized differently. And to me, this is a really important time to discuss this, as I
Yeah.
really do see our culture changing and shifting. It has been for the last 20 to 30 years, and people are fighting it.
Yeah. You talk about socialization, and in that scene, there was a lot of focus, like you said, on the father, grandfather, not the mother, not his mother, not the other women figures in his life. But I also thought there was no focus on external factors outside of the family. Okay, so not every kid is raised in this, tight knit family unit all the time. That kid goes out into the world. He goes to school. He goes into his social circles and so forth. And there wasn't, I thought, a lot of focus on that. And if you think about this kid, right, he's 13 years old. And I guess this is happening in almost real time. This is what, set in roughly 2024. So that means he was born in 2011. Practically his entire conscious life, the messages he's been receiving have been toxic masculinity. And what does a young kid make of a concept like that?
Well, again, I think you brought a perfect point, in which is being brought up in that idea of toxic masculinity. Again, that's where I think we have to look at in his concept of masculinity, and at what age did he maybe become exposed to some of those influencers, and why did he start to listen to that? It goes back to, in the 80s, there was a suicide from of some kids who they tried to, I think, sue the band because they claimed that the music in the band had led this kid to commit suicide. And I always look at music as being an indicator of how that person sees the world, and the music they listen to speaks to them. I think we want to say the same thing about what people and kids are watching on social media, on TikToks, on the kids that they hang with, that they're more indicative of where they see themselves than are they contributing. There's that interplay. Are they contributing to how they feel, or are they just a sign of social drift, as we'd say? So we want to see that. To me, it wasn't the band's fault that these kids committed suicide back in the 80s. It wasn't these toxic masculinity, these guys on the vlogs that are responsible for all these acts of violence against women. It's that these people resonate with the populations that watch them. Sometimes it starts as kind of like a drive-by watcher, like, huh. And then it speaks to something deeper inside that, to me, has been curating, it's been bubbling, it's been oozing, and it starts to manifest itself. We don't want to persecute the culture, because then we're falling into hierarchy again. We want to seek to understand. We want to look at these people that act out in what they're saying and what they're doing, and saying, okay, how did they get to? Because you're right. It often these, don't want to say these, I said it, but often kids, teens, adults who act out, they didn't grow up in violent families. They grew up in a culture that demonstrated violence in situations. They grew up in a culture where they didn't feel understood. They grew up in a culture where they didn't feel safe to express feelings of vulnerability, of fear, of sadness, of shame, of guilt. Again, that's why we're doing this whole show. So I think we want to look at how do we help to change a culture, and how do we shift that when so many aspects of it continue to almost exemplify it in ways. So in that, you just don't shut it down either, because then you create, that's how, when you had prohibition in the 1920s, what happens? You created a whole bunch of a bootleg industry of alcohol and all these speakeasies and all these hidden places where people were still drinking. When you create the situations where religion say you can't dance, well, then you create the culture of footloose, which we've seen as a teen culture of breaking away from controls. So we want to be aware, not to create something that people can bounce off of, but something that they can feel more accepted into. So we want to see how our kids are so awash in all these factors that are leading to a show that, why are so many people watching the show? It's not because necessarily it's an act of just fiction, but because it's a combination of art imitating life. And that's what we want to recognize is, how young should your kids be to watch this with you as a parent? Yeah, that's a great question. That's going to depend on your kids and their maturity, potentially what they've been exposed of. Do you know what they've been exposed of? Do you open up and say, have kids in your school talked about this show? What do your kids know? Because guess what? If their friends are talking about it in school, you then might want to watch it with them so you can be a part of that discussion and be a part of seeking solutions for them in a culture where often it's the blind leading the blind, and then just let them have those discussions and act like it's not happening. And that to me is what led to these outcomes. Our parents that saw these things that they accepted were potentially normal of what their kid was doing and maybe knew a little bit about but weren't really into, and yet then this happened right under their noses, and it leaves them questioning themselves. And those are good questions I think they ask themselves.
Yeah, and just to back up for a second, the instance you were talking about from the 80s, that was 1985, and that was an 18-year-old and 20-year-old who shot themselves after listening to Judas Priest. 5 years later, their families sued the band and CBS, who was the music publisher at the time. Obviously, a sad story. And one of the teens died instantly. The other did not and survived, even though he shot himself in the head. But I think also just illustrates the vast difference in what is influencing kids. In the
Yeah.
80s, it was that, and I'm not by any stretch putting any blame on the band or anything, but just the different factors that influence kids today. It's social media and
Right.
a
And
far
again,
cry from
yeah, and what do you have? You have the victim, persecutor, rescuer dynamic again. So you have the band becomes the persecutor, the kids are the victims of that. I would want to know, and we don't know, but again, just to look at the parallels and see what happened with those kids, that then they started to listen to the music, and what were the lyrics in the music that resonated with them? What was their ability to, or to really interpret what was going on in their life? So we're repeating the same patterns again and again and again. And who do we have to look at, to me, back at culture as a whole? We have the solutions if we work together on them. And we see ourselves often out of fear returning to ways of the past that really haven't shown solutions in the present and future. And that to me is where fear and incomplete truths drive a lot of those actions and behaviors.
Okay, Dr. E, we've talked a lot about that scene with the psychologist, with Jamie.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's so explosive. There's a lot to go back and unpack there. So
Mhm.
what do you think was happening there? I think you had suggested that, he's looking for acceptance or love in that situation.
Mhm.
Talk
Mhm.
about what unfolded and what that character was after in that moment.
Well, I think even if you look at the importance of having a female psychologist in there for this, from the standpoint of the story, as well as the standpoint of the whole, unfolding in this situation, it becomes clear in him asking, "Do you like me? Do you like me?" His need for acceptance, even from somebody who is supposed to be making a decision on his ability to stand trial. Does he and did he understand his crime? And she's got a job to do. And there are manipulations in there in the story where she brings him a sandwich. And I listened to another interpretation where the guy had a really valid discussion. She brought him in a hot chocolate, which is something kids like to drink, and she brought him in a sandwich with pickle in it. And I kind of found this interesting because the guy brought up a lot of kids don't like pickles. I'm like, I could look at that as something maybe there's some validity to, but even just bringing that discussion in, of even in the setup of that, is her teetering between childhood and adulthood. And what is again, we look at situations as sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but I think a lot of times when you're looking at these document, or at these dramas and things, is often there's second meanings and tertiary meanings to things that I think we want to look at as the symbolism. So this sandwich was something that he was rejecting because he didn't like pickles. The hot chocolate was something that he liked, but when he lost his temper with her because he felt like she was manipulating him and trying to have power, he smacks the hot chocolate away. And to me, it's almost wiping his childhood. So now he's stepping into this adulthood, which he almost sees as adult men have the right to be angry and show anger towards women or even towards other people. But you didn't see him showing it towards his dad. You didn't see him showing it in other situations. And granted, we have only snapshots of this experience, but I think it brought some of that through. And at the same time, like I said, whose love or affection, or did he want to know if liked him, but her? So we have to look at this idea as men are trying to show strength, to elicit love, to prove their worth, to prove their value. And then what happens at the end when she gets what she wants? So she was manipulating this situation. As a psychologist, she has a job to do. She's not there to be his friend. She's there to get information on his ability to stand trial. He wants to know what she's writing about him. And she's like, you're not going to see it. So again, there's these boundaries that are put in play, yet she's also pulling him in to get this response.
Yeah.
As soon as she gets the response that basically says, yeah, I realize what I did, and I know that, that it was bad, then she's like, well, this is our last session.
Yeah.
And he reacts with rage again in this.
So you talked about her manipulating the situation and manipulating him. Do you think is it okay for an adult to manipulate a child, even a child who's murdered somebody?
I think that what we have to look at is what we look at and accept, again, as culture. Do I think that, did we see the full disclosure? Because she's coming in the middle where she might have said, my job is to help you understand if you are if you can stand trial, if you understand your charges against you. And so it's all about informed consent at that level in this situation. Whereas I think we have to look at how often do we manipulate our kids, whether we're parents, whether we're teachers, whether we're psychologists or priests, or even in adulthood. What do politicians do? They manipulate their constituency. What is that going to do but affect trust? So we have to look at the effect of manipulation on with trust, especially when you have human beings who want to feel loved, they want to feel safe, they want to feel acceptance, they want to feel they belong, they want to feel they have a tribe. And when you have a sea of people out there who feel betrayed, violated, rejected, abandoned, mistrust, confused, overwhelmed, all these feelings that feel bad and wrong and weak, and they're just looking for a place to be safe and feel safe. She got him to talk about things through these different means, and it took time to then get the information she wanted. So the question is it okay to manipulate kids? I don't really feel like it's okay to manipulate anybody when you look at what your underlying motive is. I have to look at my job as a psychologist, and I will be honest with people where I say, my job is to help manipulate your perception of how you see yourself in the world with the motivation to help you to feel better, to help you to see your place in this world, to help you establish goals that are healthy. So I am clear in that when I explain that, to say, yes, this is my role and these are my intentions. And I think if she was clear in her intentions, it's a duplicitous role that we really have to look at. It's a really hard answer to come to. So
Yeah.
I know I'm giving a really long answers because it's not that easy just to give a simple answer to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and nothing about this is simple, right? The whole
No,
show is complicated, at least from what I've seen of it and what I've
it
read
is. And
about it.
just seeing his whole situation of feeling like he had been intimate. This is another intimate situation with her, where he shared his truth with a woman. He felt like he had made a connection, and then she cut it off and she leaves, and she's having to face that. I think as much as she saw this at the end, she leaves the sandwich because she almost throws up. I think what you have to look at about her own internal struggle, as well as realizing that this boy who she got to get these answers from, I think there's a level of disgust with herself in what she felt she had to do to get these answers and the
Yeah.
role she's played and held to in society, and then the outcome of that, and seeing his reactions of rage. Again, if all we ever do is focus on the rage, we never get to his feelings again of betrayal, abandonment, of feeling used, violated, of feeding his mistrust. There are only so many times that you can violate anybody's sense of mistrust and even think that they can truly come back to trusting people again. And that's one of the things I think we have to realize, especially people we give power to, like a psychologist or like a parent or like a priest or pastor. Again, I go back to politician, a teacher. So many kids have lost their trust in the education system. We touched on that in the beginning, that even the teachers felt like victims to their students because of the way they treat them, and they don't respect what they're trying to do as a job. When we got to recognize that teachers have fed mistrust in kids by treating them like they were throwaway students, by letting them be bullied and not standing up for them, and by not really being a part of their life and understanding all these pieces. And there's some wonderful teachers out there that do that and make those connections. And I was just talking to a couple kids last week who have teachers who they have bonded with them and who make those connections with them. And those are wonderful connections that I hope that they're able to remember their whole life. Whereas there are that many more people in the list of people who we feel like have violated or betrayed or allowed us to continue to be wounded in a culture that feels so unsafe.
Now, I mentioned this earlier. I want to go back to it, and that is the actor who played Jamie character in this series. This was a demanding role for a young kid, and this is his first role,
Mhm,
is my understanding. His first major role. Um,
mhm.
what do you think about the emotional demands put on a young kid for a serious role like this? And also, what do you think? I don't know if you know much about how it was shot, but it was shot in several continuous long takes. So they weren't
Mhm.
like redoing scenes over and over and cutting them together the way it's typically done on set of like a dramatic production.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts
Well,
on that? A kid of that age is he going to come away like with any scars from this, or is this just he just inhabited a character and took it and ran with it?
again, to me, it's debriefing. I think this kid needs to make sure that or young adult, because he really is a young adult in that, forming into that, is I think someone like that really needs to make sure that you do some debriefing and hopefully had that. And I think those longer takes, I know there was one take at the end of episode 2 where the inspector's talking to his son and realizes what he's missed out, and realizes he's missed his son's whole subculture. And in that connection, after he and his son go in the car to go off and get some to eat, then they have the camera rise above and go to the place where the girl died in one continuous take. And they talked about having to shoot that 14 times. The more that to me, you have to get up emotionally to do those shots and those takes, is to me the more you have to look at wearing somebody down and what's happening psychologically is really idiosyncratic. So I think we have to look at the idiosyncrasy of that. I think also we have to look at potentially the effects on anybody of doing that, whether it be a kid, a teen, or an adult. And I think we've seen the long-term effects of child acting on some of these kids as they grew up and they were put in some serious roles, or even we hear the stories about what some directors used to do and tell the kids so that they could get a cry out of them
Yeah.
years and years ago, while we have different rules on that. But I think this was, again, probably a pretty tough situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always amazed at the different things that actors go through to achieve a character, to make a role so amazing. A lot of times I think about those being physical things, like Christian Bale going down to 130 pounds, or gaining lots of weight, or changing their body in some dramatic way. I feel like for this kid it was really going to a dark place, probably emotionally,
Yeah.
rather than any
Well,
physical challenge.
yeah, and I think we come back to that, the self-development episode, and even the quantum emotions one, where I talked about us all having parts and pieces. And that's what a lot of this is about, whether you're him as the character or whether you're even him as the child, and the young adult, the emerging adult is what's happening inside of him in this creation of different emotions, aspects, beliefs, how he's seen those cultural, how he's seen those within himself, and how the culture around him is supporting him and or potentially ignoring some of those factors. So this whole issue is about our real, feel, and ideal selves and how they're manifested, whether you're, again, the main characters, whether you're the parents, whether you're the parent, the inspector who's got his job to do, who then realizes in doing his job the way he's done, he's missed the time with his son, and the parents who then realizing, how was I a parent? Was I a good parent? And then you see, so getting into that that episode, at the end, the last episode really was all about the family to me, and a lot about the parents and what they went through. And in ways, I felt like they were trying to tell each other that we were okay as parents, even though they felt that they had failed. And when the dad's van was tagged, he was trying to scrub that off, almost like if you think back to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and her washing her hands after she,
Yeah.
after the murder, and she gets that compulsion of hand washing. I almost feel like that was representative in some ways of Lady Macbeth and him trying to wash this stain of his life on it, being indicative of almost him being maybe bullied as a kid and not knowing how to handle, and looking all around and mistrusting his whole environment, experiencing a moment or re-experiencing a moment of maybe his childhood, and also experience a moment of his son's childhood, because then the bullying became about him. And what did he do after he couldn't wash it off with soap and water? He goes to try to find a solvent to take it off, almost erase that this happened, because they defaced his van, and he was a plumber as part of his job. And he's thinking, how can possibly people see me as a plumber if they're seeing this shameful tag on my car? So what somebody gives them suggestion, goes, I just recommend you get a can of paint and throw it on it. So he tosses the paint all over the van, and then he sees the kids who had basically tagged his van taunting him. So he loses his cool and runs off after them and threatens the kid. So again, he justifies his persecution. I see the act of that van of just whitewashing over his shame, his feelings of failure, his feelings of guilt, his feelings of helplessness, of hopelessness, of his own self-hatred, just trying to put a coat of paint on it to hopefully act maybe like he knows it happens, but other people won't know what's underneath there. That is the perfect manifestation or way to symbolize what, to me, we all do, is we want to cover over our pains, our hurts, our tags in our souls that others might put upon us, with basically a coat of paint that doesn't fix the problem. He still has to get his van repainted. He can't afford to do it at that time, so he just wants to cover it up. How many times in life have we had somebody tag our soul, wound our soul, injure our soul, that we don't feel we have the wherewithal or the support to fix the problem, so we just cover it up. And I think that's what we want to see as such a deep symbology of really this whole series, what it's about to me.
And I wonder with a scene like that, Dr. E, some of that is just straight up practicality, right? He's a plumber, he's a blue collar guy. He can't be showing up to jobs, uh, with his van looking like that. The paint's not ideal either, but it's just a quick fix, right?
And that's exactly the point. You have that idea of with Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Yeah.
Whereas I think also we want to look at that there's so many times in the work that I do with people that we look at what seemed like was, like I talked, convenient in the time and something to quickly solve the problem. Whereas I think we want to see that the effects deeper down inside are often have more meaning and connect with different parts and pieces and aspects of self that we want to continue to see, and just take the time to check with ourselves, to take the time to check with other people, to know that it might not be as easy as what we might want to see. Whereas, yeah, you're like I said, and you said he didn't have the time to get it properly fixed. And if he rides around with that on his van, other people don't likely know his history, but he felt singled out. He
Right.
felt like everybody saw his story. He felt, again, almost paranoid of what people knew about him because, as I say, embarrassed is when you feel exposed. Humiliation is when you feel exposed and people are using that exposure to weaponize you, or to be it as a weapon against you, and you feel also violated, helpless, betrayed, and that's where anger and rage and hatred are often going to come out in those situations to protect us, and or denial might be there first. But that's where I think he felt absolutely humiliated and betrayed and helpless to know what to do about it.
Yeah. Dr. E, this is a rather bleak show. Is life in the 2020s as bleak as this series is telling us it is?
I think I always see these shows as shows that show promise because it opens up dialogues. It puts it out there for us to look at. Do we see issues in our culture? Absolutely. But these are the times that we can see. Again, I go back to why did I do my workshops in Haiti, and why do I want to continue to do around the world? To show the adults how they perhaps been broken by culture and society, to show the young adults how they're breaking, and to help create a better world for the kids to be who they can be. And that takes us to be honest with ourselves, to come from a place of looking at the inconvenient truths, and to look at the place of really seeing what contributes to our culture of that's driven by fear, mistrust, that drives and justifies anger, rage, and hatred, acts of violence and belittling, demeaning, that drives a subculture of teens that disconnect from their parents, that they have to have these, whether now it's on social media and they have all the emojis that mean things, to years ago when they had the bracelets that they used to use, to having the songs they listen to and what they mean, to having the different languages that they used to speak, gibberish. I remember gibberish when I was a kid. So we have to look at all these ways that our kids are growing up in an environment where they don't feel they can be honest with us. And part of that is growing into adulthood. Well, how do we create an environment that our kids can be open with us and be honest with us, to share their hurts and pains, to feel like they can talk to us about their shames and their humiliations and the things that feel so damaging to them, so we can all walk through these things together, hand in hand, and help them become stronger adults that can face and embrace a world of equity and honesty and truth. A world where we don't feed and enculturate what we call toxic masculinity, in a world where men are just trying to figure out, how can I still be a man in this culture that feels so confusing? We have to stop looking at the world as full of victims and persecutors and rescuers, and see that it happens. Yet, as we understand our place in this world, we can each find where we belong and how we belong in the place that we can find truth, honor, and integrity.
I would be cautious about letting my kids watch this, just because it's a little disturbing, to be frank, you know?
And you might be surprised at what they've already been exposed to and what they
Yes.
know. That's why I'd say before you did this, I'd ask your kids what they've heard about it and or what they know.
Yeah, no, and I know, and with my kids, they've seen some adult type of entertainment, but there was something from what I've seen is that there's something very immediate about it. Some of the stuff my kids have seen, it's like set in a different time period. There's things that separate it and don't make it feel as real. This feels very like it could be very real to kids going
Oh,
through not a
absolutely.
murder, but just that, going through culture and life in the 2020s.
So here's the question I'm going to leave this with for you and the viewers is do you not want them to watch this because you feel afraid of what they may experience, or do you potentially also feel afraid of what you may find out about what they already know and or
Both.
understand?
You can see,
So,
listening to the
until
wisdom
next
of our
time.
host, Dr. E. Emotional Algebra with Dr.